It's my pleasure to introduce, in the very brief way that's conventional for us, our two speakers. Aamir Mufti, who teaches in the Department of Comparative Literature at UCLA.
I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, it's my first time speaking at the new school, and that's a very exciting prospect indeed, having spent really a big part of my life as a graduate student in New York, and partner did the PhD here. Anyway, so it's quite lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Some of you who might know some of my work will know that I have been sort of working for many years on versions of secularism and secular imagination in the Islamic world, broadly conceived, sort of a very broadly conceived rubric of my interest and work. And have been accused of all kinds of things as a result of being an elitist secularist, and all those kinds of things. So I've sort of recently begun a project in which I actually have very little to say about secular imagination, but rather I look at versions of Islam today, Islamic belief and practice. So this came as a welcome invitation in some ways to begin to think about the overview of that project, because I've begun it sort of in the middle, with the middle section about the figure of the European convert to Islam, focusing on the figure of on two figures, Muhammad Asad and Maryam Jamila. In any case, so I really am very grateful for this invitation. It's given me an opportunity to put some material together that I've been sort of teaching and playing around with for a while. Okay, so Islam as a political concept. To attempt to speak in a talk of 20 or 30 minutes about so enormous and complex a question as Islam as a political concept is by all measures a fool's errand, even if one decides and manages to somehow sidestep the seemingly empirical difficulties of harnessing multiple archives across languages, centuries, continents, civilizations, tendencies, sects, and schools of thought. A whole series of difficulties and paradoxes of a different order still present themselves, and I shall reflect in a moment on what kinds of difficulties these are exactly. The most visible difficulty of this sort, perhaps, concerns the first noun in this phrase, Islam. This word is, of course, a proper name, and its modes of usage, its rhetorical instabilities, the notoriously wide range of its designations, its relations to a deeply contested terrain of politics and culture, including geopolitics and global culture, and, if I may be allowed this somewhat dangerous pun, its largely explosive nature, all these are by now well-known problems associated with any effort undertaken with a view to stabilizing the social semiotics of the space marked by Islam. For some years now, we have designated these difficulties by the critical term Orientalism. The purpose of his book of that name, Edward Said tells us repeatedly, was to explore the possibility that knowledge systems with a deep rootedness in one set of societies, which had risen to dominance in the world system in the modern era, could give an account of another group of societies over which they had exercised dominance in one form or another, and survived the consequences humanly, as he puts it. How could knowledge practices linked to the North Atlantic, Said seems to ask, orient themselves towards the societies of Islamic background, given the long history of the involvement of knowledge and representation in precisely those relations of domination? But this work was merely begun in Said's landmark study, it seems to me, and took their propedeutic form, a broad indication of the epistemological difficulties that such a project would need to confront. How exactly we might produce post-Orientalist ways of thinking about contemporary Arab or Muslim societies, or the religious civilization of Islam as such, cannot be surmised directly from Said's book itself. This has, of course, long been understood, which had notoriously, we might note, bracketed off the question of, as he puts it, any correspondence or lack thereof between cultures and nations whose location is in the East and Orientalism and its ideas about the Orient, unquote. That's a composite quote from the introduction. Obviously, a wide range of contemporary scholarship and critical thinking are involved in navigating this problem in various ways and to varying degrees of success. In the extended present, that is the aftermath of 9/11, it has become clearer than it was before that Said's book represented a warning about the possible rise of the very forms, the very kinds of escalation and polarization between West and East, Islamic East, that have become routine in the last several years, and that it called for a new kind of intellectual relationship between them than had historically been the case in the modern era, as the basis for a transformed political and existential relationship as well. Already identified as such by Said in that work, Islam has now clearly emerged as one of the most pliable, protean, and yet ubiquitous and persistent political signifiers of our times. Clearly, Islam, overcoded and overdetermined, is implicated in a variety of political scenarios around the world. This leads us to the second substantive noun, implied adjectively in my opening phrase, namely politics, which poses its own unique set of problems that are nevertheless not entirely distinct from those posed by the first. Excuse me. Obviously a term, that's to say politics, obviously a term with a distinct Western genealogy, that is implicated as it is in the emergence as such of the conception of the West, its self-conception we might say, politics cannot entirely escape the question of its very applicability in the social world of Islam. To whom exactly belongs, we might say, the concept Islam as a political concept? In what way might it travel across the global antagonisms to which it has a complex relationship between global North and South, secular West and religious East, Judeo-Christian civilization, and Islam? We are, for instance, faced with the difficulty that those constellations we usually refer to as political Islam have often renounced the political as such. A siyasa in Arabic and in a number of the languages of the Muslim world, as inimical to the Islamic tradition and therefore to the task of Islamic reconstruction that they propagate. This renunciation or disavowal of the political cannot be considered as trivial or accidental, but neither can its significance be gauged simply on its own terms. It marks, I shall shortly argue, the constitutive invisibility of the political in the most political forms of contemporary Islam. In his late essay on the philology of world literature, in my view, one of the most significant writings to reconsider the relationship of philology to philosophical historicism since Herder, Erich Auerbach suggests a method for dealing with what he described as a sudden and massive expansion of the languages and literatures with which the literary historian of world literature must now, he says, contend, that is to say, in the post-war era. The method consists, you will recall, he argues, of identifying an Ansatzpunkt, a starting point, a point of departure, a well-defined or circumscribed problem concerning a genre, author, period, text, or even individual motif, by which the elusive whole can be, he says, seized. As I have argued elsewhere, this figure of quantitative expansion, he says, all of a sudden we have too many languages to consider and too many literatures. This figure of quantitative expansion is a recoding of the qualitative necessity for the European humanist for epistemological rethinking at the threshold of the post-colonial era, namely the entire process, the colonial process of the imagining of the world as an assemblage of textual traditions whose genealogy takes us to the emergence of modern Orientalism in the late 18th century. This is a book manuscript that I've just finished, really just telegraphed very quickly the argument. In a parallel fashion, we should not mistake the problems I have outlined above as simply empirical ones, as pertaining to quantity, Islam being too many things, but rather as marking a complex historical process involving colonization and decolonization and the implication of the very possibilities of historical knowledge within it. I wish to propose here, therefore, as starting point, an engagement with a certain motif in one text by one author, albeit an important and widely influential text by an important and widely influential author, from which I will then attempt to broaden the discussion at the end to offer some ideas about the broader question brought by the invitation I was given to speak of Islam as a political concept. This is, as I said, an impossible task, but for that you have to blame the invitation. The starting point is the elaboration of a motif in the book Milestones, Ma'alim fi Tariq, published in 1964, a book by Sayyid Qutb, the martyr philosopher of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and worldwide, who spent much of the last decade and more of his life in prison, from 54 to 64, and then back again, and then for the remainder of his life, a couple of years. Essentially the entire period of Nasser's rise in Egypt. Who spent much of the last decade and more of his life in prison with other leading members of the organization, repeatedly tortured and finally convicted and executed on the charge of conspiring to overthrow the Nasserite regime, a show trial and made-up charges in 1966. Very badly tortured for over long periods of time by all accounts. The motif I have in mind, the motif in question is Tawheed, oneness or unity, but more specifically in Islamic discourse, belief or profession in the indivisibility of God, the monotheistic creed, you might say. I say motif here rather than concept or belief in order to highlight the manner of its appearance in Qutb's discourse, constellated and reconstellated in different contexts, and the ways in which it produces effects on other elements in these various arrangements and is in turn affected by them. I am of course aware that in speaking of Tawheed as motif rather than say belief, I am proposing a certain way of reading Qutb's text as against many others. Milestones begins with a description of the world in which the pious Muslim finds himself, and the figure is gendered certainly in this way in the book, he, as the return of, as he puts it, Jahiliyyah. This is the first constellation of Tawheed that we shall look at here. Jahiliyyah, literally ignorance, with a capital I almost, is a term for the state of the world and of Arabian society in particular before the reception of God's message by human beings in the Quranic revelation. It has a perfectly secularized historiographical usage as well, as in the title of Taha Hussein's classic study of the poetry of pre-Islamic Arabia, Ashya fil Asr Jahili. It is, we could therefore say, a historical concept that distinguishes human history in the age of Islam from everything that came before it. Qutb's innovation is to characterize the modern era as a return of Jahiliyyah, of the pre-Islamic. Humanity has once again become a stranger to the message of God and to the laws for the conduct of human affairs contained in his revelation. Ironically, this is especially the case in those societies that claim to be Muslim. The majority of whose inhabitants consider themselves to be believers in Muhammad as the Rasul or messenger or apostle of God, in whom the sequence of revelations through which God addressed humanity across the ages, including the Torah and the New Testament, came to a final conclusion. I'll cite a small passage from Milestones. Qutb writes, "We are surrounded by Jahiliyyah today, which is of the same nature as it was during the first period of Islam, this state of almost metaphysical or cosmic really ignorance, which is of the same nature as it was during the first period of Islam, perhaps a little deeper. Our whole environment, people's beliefs and ideas, habits and art, rules and laws, is Jahiliyyah, even to the extent that what we consider to be Islamic culture, Islamic sources, Islamic philosophy and Islamic thought are also constructs of Jahiliyyah," unquote. Thus, although we might say that, I quote again, the Jahili society the Jahili society is any society other than the Muslim society. Given the present reality of the latter, all the societies existing in the world today are Jahili. And this is again a composite quote. This applies furthermore not only to the colonized sectors of society, but also to those, and perhaps more poignantly so, to the supposedly traditional sectors of Muslim society, including mosques and shrines at the center of devotional practices. For instance, the cult of Sayyida Zainab in Cairo, the famous mosque and shrine of the granddaughter of the Prophet. To say the least, this raises intriguing questions about what a Muslim is, as an individual or as society or in society, and I shall come to that in a moment. Suffice it for us here to note that this innovation of Qutb's, which reduces most of what passes for Islamic life in the modern era to unbelief and ignorance, has proven highly controversial in Islamic disputation, around which Qutb's legitimacy as an explicator of the Islamic tradition has been questioned or defended. Long ongoing debate between those who would actually accuse him of being an unbeliever for having declared all of Islamic history and tradition and sources to be in fact un-Islamic. And then, of course, the argument in his defense. Society may be said to have reverted to Jahiliyyah whenever God is no longer sovereign, Qutb says, over every aspect of it, every aspect of social life, and his laws for the ordering of human life are ignored. But this comparison of modern society to that of pre-Islamic Arabia raises another intriguing question. For the society out of which Islamic monotheism emerged was, of course, a polytheistic one, in a literal sense. How then are we to understand the presence and role of this element in the contemporary Islamic world for Qutb? This leads us to our second constellation, namely shirk, association or substitution, all those lapses of the human mind that undermine in practice the belief in the indivisibility of God, even in practice, not just in belief. So you may claim to believe in the monotheistic creed, but your practices cancel that belief in some way, contradict that belief. That too would be shirk. Qutb's notion of Jahiliyyah, the great ignorance, thus introduces a circular, or more accurately perhaps, eruptive concept of time. The state of ignorance threatening to erupt in the midst of a historical process and negating any progress that humanity might have made towards knowledge of its own place and role in the universe and towards structuring its life accordingly. If Jahiliyyah marks the macro-temporality of historical time, then shirk may be said to mark its micrological instantiation. Any belief or practice that allows an extraneous person, idea, or thing to share, that's the etymological root of the word shirk, to share in the total sovereignty of God, that is God's alone, is thus an instance of shirk. In its constellation with shirk, therefore, Tawheed, profession of faith in the indivisibility of God, appears as a process and a struggle, constantly confronting the threat of its own negation. The modern concept of politics, for instance, and this is of course a very important point for Qutb and for really the Muslim Brotherhood as well in its history as a political political formation. The modern concept of politics, for instance, which I quote again, takes the form of claiming that the right to create values, to legislate rules of collective behavior, and to choose any way of life rests with men without regard to what God has prescribed, unquote, represents nothing less than an act of, I quote again, rebellion against God's sovereignty on earth. It transfers to man one of the greatest attributes of God, namely sovereignty, and makes some men lords over others, unquote. The invitation to Islam, da'wah, which may be described simply as the invitation to total submission to the will and sovereignty of God, according to Qutb, is thus a test for humanity as such, a test which most societies over most of human history have failed. However, there is an example of success as well, that is pertinent and urgent in its availability to Muslims worldwide, namely the original society of Muslims, that is, the society founded by the Prophet and his followers, whose structure and development are described in the Quran itself and in the established traditions of the Prophet, the Sunnah and Hadith. Qutb's project is thus explicitly an instance of Salafiyya, Salafism in the American neoliberal argot. I can't stand that pronunciation. And just to sort of ismize it is a complete sort of lack of understanding of what Salafiyya is in modern Islamic history. Qutb's project is thus explicitly an instance of Salafiyya, the diffuse and decentralized tendency rather than movement. Even that is an inadequate description, actually, in Sunni Islamic thought that emerged across the Muslim world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries out of the violent encounter with modern European colonialisms. The central figure of this, in remarkably similar ways in the different regions of the Islamic world, from India through Russian Central Asia to the Arab Middle East to North Africa, in remarkably similar ways. The central figure of this tendency is revealed in the name itself, Salafiyya, which contains a gesture towards the originary generation of Islam, the so-called companions of the Prophet, the Salaf Saleh, as the term goes, That's the reference in the term Salafiyya. The Salaf as-Salih, righteous forebears, whom Qutb calls the unique Quranic generation. Given this state of affairs, Qutb notes, it is absurd to expect an Islamic society to emerge fully formed from the Jahili society. What is needed instead is for a small group of individuals to partially withdraw from the surrounding society, this all-encompassing Jahiliyyah as he calls it, and turn themselves into living examples of the Islamic way of life. I didn't time myself. Will you warn me when I have about 5 minutes left? Okay. And turn themselves into living examples of the Islamic way of life. This would be akin to the Quranic method itself, he says, which in the earlier Meccan revelations, the revelations that came in the Meccan period of the Islamic community, when the Prophet was in his native city of Mecca, and Muslims an oppressed minority, akin to the Quranic method itself, which in the earlier Meccan revelations focused on elements of the faith for the minority Muslims, rather than legislation for the perfect social order, elements of the faith, in other words, rather than legislation for the perfect social order, shifting to the latter in the later Medina phase, the so-called Madani verses of the Quran, of the early Islamic community after the Prophet and his band of followers escape persecution in Mecca and are welcomed by the city of Yathrib, which then becomes known as the city of the Prophet, Medina for short. Okay. Only when the invitation has been repeatedly offered, da'wah, invitation, and heard by large numbers of people can the question of legislation, that is the question of the nature of the state, actually arise, Qutb says. And really in some ways, if we think about the recent debates in Egypt and the sort of role of the Muslim Brotherhood in electoral politics and the whole complex relationship of its victory and then the coup and the overthrow, this question has been extremely important. In some ways, the terms that Qutb has set up are very, very much a live question. Whether or not they should have run a candidate for president, for instance. Whether or not Egyptian society is ready for the legislative project of Sharia, essentially. Right? And there are those who argue that it was now, 40 years after, as it were, Qutb's moment. Only when the invitation, da'wah, has been repeatedly offered and heard by large numbers of people can the question of legislation, that is the question of the nature of the state, actually arise. Without it, the call for Islamic legislation, he says, is a vulgar joke on Islam. It is to this vanguard, as he calls it, Taliya, and as I understand it, it's the term that is used both in the Leninist sense, in Arabic, for the vanguard party, and for the artistic avant-garde. It's the term that is used for both. And of course, he was trained as a literary critic and practiced, varieties of writing genres and all of that before his, as it were, conversion in the late 1840s. So he's very well aware of the aesthetic sort of meaning of this term, Taliya. It is to this vanguard, Qutb repeatedly notes, that his little book is directed as a sort of manual for the task at hand. There is, of course, a poignancy to this, as the book was written in prison, as the author faced torture and the prospect of a lonely death. This hellish experience, in fact, lends to the treatise its characteristic note of righteous anger, the record of a mind in agony and a life made minimally bearable by the certainty that its tormentors are not merely moral or political enemies, but rebels against the very expressed intention of God. Given Qutb's understanding of human nature, that is, the nature of man as revealed in his history, and given his view of the modern political concept as such, as a form of abandonment of the monotheistic creed of Tawheed, this vanguard task acquires a cosmic importance and is not to be understood as political at all for him. We are now in the fourth constellation in our consideration, in the third constellation, in our consideration of the appearance of Tawheed in Qutb's text. That is the notion of ummah or community. 5 minutes. Speaking of the Salaf, or original community of Muslims, Qutb notes that his acceptance of Islam meant a complete break with their former lives, with ties of family, tribe, race, language, nation, or region. And I quote, "For Islam based the Islamic society on the association of belief alone, instead of low associations based on race and color, language and country, regional and national interests," unquote. To enter Islam is to break with your community of birth completely, birth and upbringing completely, and to even encounter it as an enemy, as was repeatedly the case with the early Muslims. The Prophet himself, Qutb points out, sundered his ties with his lineage and tribe and suffered as the victim of their diatribe and oppression. And yet, of course, these very organizational features of Arab society continued to be operative, even in the political and military calculations of the community itself, the Muslim community itself. In the contemporary world of universal Jahiliyyah, this difficulty takes an even more dramatic form. If no society in the world can be considered a Muslim society, then what does it mean to say that the task of reconstruction is to establish the movement in some Muslim country, as he puts it? The judgment that Muslims are not Muslims opens up an aporia in which the concept of ummah, or community of believers, is in tension with the socius, as the universal with the particular, the global with the local. In a brilliant essay written some years ago, Aziz al-Azmeh, the Syrian, really in my mind the most important contemporary Syrian historian, political thinker, most important scholar of contemporary Islam, in a brilliant essay written some years ago, Aziz al-Azmeh has identified this tension in what he calls Wahhabite polity, namely the structure of articulation between Wahhabite ulama and Wahhabite theology on the one hand, and the House of Saud as tribal and kinship structure with its distinct forms of dissent and solidarity. It's the most brilliant account of what the Saudi system is. He says that the Wahhabite theologians, ulama, whose theology would precisely negate such a thing, are in alliance with the kinship and lineage-based structure of the House of Saud. So that repeatedly, cyclically, they are bound to throw up a kind of rebellion against the system, like the 79 takeover of the mosque in Mecca, the Kaaba in Mecca, and like you could say Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Okay, so where do we go from here? It is commonplace to argue that the concept of Islam developed in thinkers such as Qutb is a Protestant one. This characterization is correct in its own way, but it also carries the possibility, the danger we might say, that it might block further investigation by providing a ready-made frame of understanding drawn from the European Reformation. It is more important, because more fruitful, I think, to examine the rise of Salafiyya in its own historical environment, which is, of course, the violent encounter between Muslim societies and European colonialisms in the 19th and 20th centuries. The emergence of rationalizing Protestant forms of Islam marks an accommodation to the colonial state and its structures and epistemologies in places like Egypt. Far from constituting an autonomous religious culture, unaltered by the expansionist and supposedly assimilating culture of the modern West, the neo-orthodoxy of modern Islam, as I suggest we call it, emerges precisely at the moment of the radical transformation of culture and authority under colonial conditions, a space for the articulation of diverse and often competing neo-orthodox claims rather than a peculiar set of claims as such. It upended the balance and structure of relations between juridico-theological authority tied to the space of Sharia, Islamic law, and a host of other institutions, practices, and forms of authority, above all the vast space of so-called heterodox religious belief and practice that is usually defined inadequately as Sufism, now rendered heterodox from the perspective of the juridical. Therefore, any attempt to respond adequately to the religio-cultural crisis of modern Muslim societies has to look beyond the legalist terrain of Sharia that has become uniquely empowered since colonial times, beyond, for instance, the project of unearthing the basis for religious tolerance or women's rights in the scriptural and legal sources themselves. This is a common move that all kinds of so-called sort of liberal or moderate or whatever Muslim thinkers are making today, actually going back to the Sharia and, proving everything, basically that it was already a form of liberal democracy or something of that sort. Alongside a description of the politics explicitly announced in the requisite posture of piety, and thinking in the background here of Sabah Mahmood's work, alongside a description of the politics explicitly announced in the requisite posture of piety that the legalist sphere seeks to elicit from believers, for instance, we must also begin the work of recuperating the orientations towards the social and the political that are implicit in the forms of devotion called for in the range of Sufi practice, again inadequate term, from popular forms of worship that are often derided by the politically pious to the devotional element in poetic traditions. In colonial and post-colonial modernity, the dynamic tension between legalistic piety and what we might call devotion is transformed into a kulturkampf, but one which is fought on the ground of the former, on the ground of the legalistic and juridical. In this rearrangement of authority in culture and society, the colonial moment thus marks the triumph of the theologico-juridical in Sunni Islam, and the very establishment of Sunnism itself as orthodoxy against a range of now externalized practices such as varieties of Shiism, some with centuries-long history of regional or local preeminence, often overlapping with Sunni practices and communities. I'm going to have to leave a page out. I'm sorry. I've been told that I'm out of time, but I am out of time. But I can try and maybe fill the gaps in questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both thought-provoking talks. I have a question for both speakers. If we need to rethink Islam, indeed Europe, outside of the whole series of problems that go under the heading of Orientalism, should we not begin in the first place by getting rid of this sort of mismatch between a religion, Islam, and a geographical entity, be it the West or Europe, in the first place? Because it seems to me that this is not just a problem, but it's the problem. And it's interesting indeed that if one looks at the program, right, coming from nowhere, it immediately strikes the incongruity in all the sessions, the fact that Islam is the only religion in the program, and that it's paired with Europe, right? So, of course, this is done critically on purpose, but we can say that the same problem that Orientalism faces, that is reproducing the very same category that it's trying to dismantle by trying to dismantling, is being reproduced in this panel, where we try to get rid of this geographical mismatch precisely by endorsing it. So, of course, the problem is not simply, I'm not sure that Europe, in contrast to the West, is something that is there, because I mean, it's an equally, at least in my view, it's an equally ambiguous, free-floating things. Of course, we've been talking about it for a long time, but I think the problem is the same. But more in general, it seems to me, the problem is, what are we doing when we say West? It seems to me the problem remains West of what? We're doing two things when we say West, and I'm still so puzzled that the word is still being used. I mean, constantly on the New York Times, almost every day. Whenever there is Islam, there's a reference to the West. Or if it's not the West, it's Europe, right? Now, what we do when we say West, we are doing two operations. First, we transform something that is spherical, because in a globe, properly speaking, you cannot say East or West. So we transform something that is spherical in a bidimensional map, right? But which kind of map? We don't put China at the center of this map, we put Europe, right? So we are completely stuck whenever we say West into Eurocentrism, but not understood as racism, or technically speaking, understood as looking at the things from the point of view of a bidimensional map, which has Europe at its center.
To the question, please.
Yes, so the question is, are we really provincializing Europe, and can we provincialize Europe if we still have maps and mismatch between geography and religion?
You're absolutely right, but there are, about the mismatches, but where I would resist the correction would be at the limits of how history would correct itself. In other words, there are incongruities that are historical, that are not imposed by conceptual mappings of my own or other people's. So that the extent to which categories are national, religious, cultural, and geographically are in a way produced through historical realities, and those realities are difficult to correct. Where I think a category such as Europe remains potentially interesting, and I think more interesting than the West, and I was using the West just as a kind of brief transition and foil, I'm not really concerned with it, has to do with the capacity to self-correct by engaging in advocacy of the opposite of the default position, or the opposite position from its own default position, so that Europe becomes a correction of certain nationalist or geographical or, in fact, monocultural models, whether those monocultural models are Christianity, Catholicism versus Protestantism, one region versus another, or ultimately Christianity and Islam, which is still the case in debates about contemporary Europe. So Europe is a category that is somehow more interesting because of its desire to transcend some of these own boundaries, whether they are geographic or not. So I think there's still some kind of critical power in the category, and just as the category cannot get away from the place, even though it does get away from the place, it also can't get away from the incongruities that are produced historically. So I don't think we can clean these things up. I don't think we can be historically accurate in cleaning them by imposing. So we can't make order out of identity positions. I think it's impossible. You just create another form of kind of violent abstraction.
Yeah, I mean, I would say something probably overlapping as well. I mean, you know, it seems to me the fact that I've deconstructed something doesn't mean it goes away, right? So the fact that I have a certain skepticism towards the kind of synthetic thing that is Islam or that is Europe, and that I can demonstrate the ways in which each of these is, you know, a kind of fiction, a kind of regulating fiction in all kinds of situations, doesn't mean that they don't have phenomenal reality, really, right? And that they don't have social life. So, and neither of them. I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right to be skeptical. And you know, when you say religion, maybe on the one hand, continent on the other. Is that the term you use for Europe? Continent, geographical. Yeah, geographical continent. But they're not exclusively that. I mean, you could even say, of course, that Islam is becoming in many ways racialized now. You know, in the post 9/11 era, as we know. I'm not saying anything original here. In the way that Europe is also obviously racialized, not just a kind of and has long been, not just a kind of geographical designation. So I don't think there are any clean terms. You know, I don't think there are any terms that don't present us with these problems. And the question is, the point is to keep returning to the problems and not lose sight of them. The problems you call Orientalism.
Thank you both for your papers. I have a question for Aamir, mainly because I was trying to follow at the end and you skipped the final paper, so I think this is going to be an opportunity hopefully for you to say something. I can read the remaining
page now.
Let me just ask the question and then see if it. But I was very interested in this sort of reconstruction of an orthodoxy of Islam that you brought out in reading Sayyid Qutb. And in particular in the ways in which there were sort of these moments in what you were saying that could go another way in what he said. So for example, what you need is to go back to the Meccan period, and Muslims as an oppressed group could mean something very different, it would seem, than what he was maybe trying to do. So I think you were hinting at that, but that for example, Muslims wouldn't in Muslim society be able to do it, but in conditions of oppression, or that other groups that are considered heterodox would be the ones that would actually be able to do this. So I was kind of interested in pushing that a little bit because I could sort of see it happening, and I was also interested in what you were saying about the reconstruction of orthodoxy under colonial conditions in particular.
Yeah, but that was sort of the concluding page that I didn't get to, the latter thing. Is this not working?
It's working.
Is it working? Okay.
Maybe it's good.
Good. Yeah, so that's sort of the kind of concluding. I just a few conclusions at the end very quickly, really telegraphing a broader argument in some way. But Qutb, and I mean, he's very interested in the Muslim as minority, as oppressed minority, because the only Muslims he knows are an oppressed minority, meaning like-minded people. His torturers are not Muslim. The pharaoh who rules over Egypt is not a Muslim, right? The whole sort of equating of Nasser with the return of pharaohism, and that entire line of thinking that emerges out of his own work and his various colleagues and predecessors in the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim as a minority is a very profound notion for him. That to enter Islam is to enter a state of perpetual self-sacrifice, and at most to be able to present yourself an example precisely in your suffering and your self-sacrifice to the universe of the infidels who are all around in this nominally, supposedly Muslim society. But as I said, the Muslim kind of opens up an aporia really, because it's a structure of undecidability. If there are no Muslims in the world, then why begin with a Muslim society or something of that sort? So the very notion of the Islamic community is a kind of impossible notion in his writing. Okay, the second thing that you mentioned, which is kind of really the larger point of this argument in some way, and of this close reading of this one text. The text is not an accidental choice, by the way. It's an enormously influential, maybe the most important work of Islamist apologetics in the 20th century. Widely circulated, widely translated into every language in which Muslims live their lives. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And that was the purpose of the writing. He extracted much of it from his 30-volume commentary on the Quran. Okay, and this is a little book. I mean, it's more than a pamphlet, but it's a short treatise. So it's an important work in that regard. What I was trying to say is that the largest sort of impetus is to argue against certain forms of post-secularist thinking today. Okay. And really a kind of widely held assumption across the spectrum, from Christopher Hitchens to to the new anthropology of Islam, to Sabah Mahmood, let's say, or Tulal Asad. Is Tulal here? I'm sorry, it's not here. The unspoken and very often spoken assumption that political Islam is a return to the Islamic tradition. After the sort of displacements of the colonial moment, after the dislocation of the colonial moment, this represents an attempt to return to some conception of the Islamic society, etc., etc. I mean, this is quite widely held view, that the political Muslims, the Islamists, are there is an attachment of a claim to authenticity, and that's certainly part of the Islamist discourse. And my whole sort of attempt is to show the way in which this supposed return to tradition is the most radically Protestant devastation of tradition in all forms, under the conditions of the colonial state, its institutions, and its epistemologies. And hence this establishing of the law, right? Think of the law in the colonial state. I'm sorry to miss the early discussion of law, and it's part of it. And that essentially gets applied to the Islamic material, and this neo-orthodoxy is fundamentally neo-orthodoxy. That's the argument I'm trying to make, rather than an orthodoxy, and how it is produced, and how it is transmitted and reproduces itself. Sorry, didn't go that long.
Interesting.
I was very impressed by your talk, and I want just to make a remark. Well, the title is Islam.
Could I actually ask people to identify themselves since I don't know anyone?
Oh, sorry, Barbara Gassan. Okay. The title is Islam, and then
you know.
Yeah.
and then during your talk, you travel from one word to another. Of course, one Arabic word to another one. Could you theorize a little bit?
That's a Barbara Gassan question,
Yes.
obviously.
Because when you were talking, I was thinking of an idea we all had. When I say all, I mean Jacques Lesra. I mean also Bashir Diagne, Suleiman Bashir Diagne. Is to have a reflection about the words that constitute the three monotheisms, and to compare them.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted you for this project, but could you tell us more about the link between Arabic language and Islam? What you were saying?
Yeah,
about
it's
that.
such an enormously interesting question, obviously, and I really can't claim to be the right person to try and map that space for us. But I don't hesitate to speculate. I can speculate in the spirit of this conference. I would say that when I was talking about Qutb's conception, and it's a widely shared conception. This is not just unique to him, partly because of his importance and influence and dissemination of his work. A widely shared set of problems, let's say, than even positions. But when he talks about the Ummah, when he talks about the Islamic community of believers, right, the whole problem is what happens to the sources, what happens to all aspects of social life, which the moment of conversion is meant to overcome and to cancel out in a totalizing fashion, right? You forget your kin, you forget the kin structure that you're part of. You forget everything. It's a new birth, really, right? So, and of course, the question of language is very, very important there. Language is you're not being asked to leave behind your language, but it's also it's a renewal of the language itself in certain ways. This Islamic conversion, this moment of creating the Islamic community. It's a transformation, obviously, of Arabic as well. And again, as I said, I'm not a scholar of these matters, but I know that this is very carefully argued by many scholars. The innovation that takes place in Arabic linguistic practice, right, in the formation of the early Islamic communities. My method here was, as I said, to think about constellations. Each of these terms, not as a concept, not as a belief, but as a kind of radiating center which brings around it a whole bunch of other things in a certain order, constellation in that sense, that therefore affects each of these elements in a certain way. And if you change the order, the meanings change really dramatically. So I was thinking of this, the central notion, that of the monotheistic confession, Tawheed. I mean, if you want to find a center, you would say that's the center itself. And I was trying to understand the way in which a whole series of other terms that are clearly operative in this rethinking of the nature of Islam and being Muslim, a very modernist account of it, right? The way in which each of these terms, which have a certain importance in its discourse, has its own kind of radiating power, that it draws other elements towards it in certain arrangements and gives them sort of particular kinds of significance. In terms of the language of the Quran, of course, I mean, you can't translate the Quran, right? The Quran is untranslatable, literally. When you give a version of the Quran in another language, you don't call it a translation. I mean, that's considered seriously heterodox. And what you're offering is a commentary in another language. Tafsir is usually the word, but there are other terms depending on what kind of commentary it is. So if you want untranslatables, this is the mother of all untranslatables. And yet, of course, precisely in that forbidding of translation is a flourishing of the process and event of translation, right? I mean, so that is to say, attempting to bring the semantic spaces of certain terms and constellations that I've described into other natural languages. I mean, that's an original problem in the spread of Islam, obviously, historically, but given a particular form in the modern moment with thinkers like Sayyid Qutb. He's of course also relying on people who didn't write in Arabic massively. His biggest influence probably is the Indian thinker, Islamist thinker. Really, the Muslim Brothers is I would say more or less it's the prototype for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the Jamaat Islami in South Asia, in all the countries of what was Pichon-Rivière, founded in the 1920s in North India. Anyway, and so that's already being made available. I mean, people are hungry for this work, which is written in Urdu, and they are hearing about it in Egypt. And there's a whole project now. How do we turn? That's not a normal route of translation from Urdu to Arabic, And so that produces its own sort of scenarios of translation, requiring translation in that direction. Whereas we're familiar with translation in the other direction. But yes, I mean it's a foundational question in the kind of global account he is giving of the Islamic community. And at heart, it's a kind of project of translation.
Just add very briefly to this fascinating response that I think the translatability, untranslatability paradox is really the fundamental principle of the humanities. I would even go so far as to say it's a competency test for capacity in the humanities. In other words, if you get this problem of the translatability, untranslatability tension, you can go further. and most American social scientists don't get it. And it's a very, very interesting kind of cultural capacity, incapacity. But I think it's also very closely related to what I would call the kind of contingency of concepts, or the historical and cultural contingency of the concept. And this is to return to its gather, right? I mean, to return to this earlier question about, in other words, what we call religion. In other words, just as there is this kind of, what I'm very moved to hear you talk about is a certain Protestant version of kind of orthodoxy. There are categories which we assume to be real material categories, but which are in fact the inventions of Protestant scholarship. Religion as a category or as a concept is precisely this kind of invention, which is a deeper source of, and a different kind of source of the church-state separation, so to speak. But in that context, which does not impact on the argument of Sheen's paper, which also has a context, but the actual concept of religion is highly specific and possibly not applicable, not accurate, which then also problematizes the incongruities that we talked about.
If we go back to the problem of untranslatability of Islam and we relate translation to monotheistic religion, we should go back to the translation of the Bible into Greek and Aramaic, which is the condition for the possibility of Christianity, I think. So translation and monotheism goes all the way back. I have a special temporal question for both of you. I mean, space and time. Michael, you mentioned two meeting spaces, or two spaces in which Europe, the imaginary Europe and its imaginary other mix. One in the literature, or in the literature and in music, with Schubert and Lessing, and one in Cairo through Said. Now these are very different spaces of interaction, and I wonder if you can say something about it, the way you moved from the one to the other, maybe back and forth, or maybe it's just one-way street. I'm not sure. And about time, one of the striking points I think that came from your description of this political theology, I would say, is its peculiar temporality. It is directed to the past, to early Islam. It is directed to the future, kind of waiting till the society will be ready for the conversion, and it empties the present. Now, I wonder if this is a true description, and if you can use it in order to compare this version of Islam to some of its rivals, especially the Shia.
I couldn't really answer the last question, I think, very adequately, except that all things Shia are, of course, the antagonists in Qutb's discourse. So I would really have to think more about, about the messianistic aspect of temporality and how that would figure here. I would have to think more about that. The sort of extended wait for end times and return of the Messiah figure, as it were, the Imam, in Shiism, that is. So I'd have to really think more about that. I don't think I want to put my foot in my mouth about it. As for his temporality, you're absolutely right. I mean, the present appears to be a strangely empty place, actually. And at the very least, a deeply degraded place. I mean, a place of a kind of cosmic ignorance. It's not just a sort of we're living through bad times. No, it's really in a cosmic scheme of things. It's unbelievable where we are somewhere. And the past, but the past is not on a historical continuum. I mean, it's the origin. It's the moment of origin. And to the extent that you can talk about the past historically, you would have to say that it's a series of degradations. But he's not even talking about the past historically. I mean, in some ways I could say there's a kind of classicism here, rather than a historicism, where there is a return to an origin that has never been repeated, and yet the whole goal is to somehow recreate it and repeat it in some future. And the affective labor of that, which is actually somatic, right? I mean, just the clarity of thinking about the physical suffering, literally, of bodies and minds and collectives of persons, that would be necessary in order to reach this. I don't want to say classical, because there's no kind of, obviously, raises aesthetic issues and all that, and that's very problematic. But this past, which is discontinuous with the present. It's not as if we've arrived in the present by a series of steps from the past. It's a fall, it's like the fall, and it has just happened once and for all. And the only thing that we can do now is to wipe out everything that has come in between, everything that is there, all of history, as it were, in order to capture the origin of it.
That's a wonderful place to end.
Is it really?